Some secrets are buried so deep in the wilderness that even time forgets where it left them. The October mist clung to Mount Mitchell's ancient ridges like a mourner's veil, and Dr. Sarah Chen knew she was walking into the same nightmare that had claimed her research partner 12 years ago. Her hands trembled as she positioned the thermal cameras among the gnarled rhododendron bushes, not from the mountain cold, but from the weight of unanswered questions that had haunted her every sleepless night since Marcus disappeared. She'd built a respectable career studying migration patterns of black bears, but the truth was darker. She'd never stopped searching for whatever took her partner from that Cherokee burial ground on a night just like this one. The first camera captured movement at 11:47 p.m. Something massive, upright, moving with an intelligence that made her blood freeze. But it was the second camera that shattered everything she believed about science, about reality, about the thin line between predator and prey. The creature turned, looked directly into the lens, and spoke her name with Marcus's voice. What kind of monster remembers the people it's supposed to forget? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sarah's finger hovered over the camera's replay button, her entire body rigid with disbelief. The fog seemed to press closer against the windows of her field station, a converted ranger cabin she'd rented for the month, as if the mountain itself was listening. She'd watched the footage 17 times now, and each viewing made the impossible more undeniably real. Sarah. The voice echoed in her memory, distorted by 12 years and whatever hell Marcus had endured, but unmistakably his. She'd heard him call her name 1,000 times during their graduate studies at Duke, usually followed by some terrible joke about Bigfoot or his latest theory about undiscovered species hiding in the Appalachian hollers. Marcus Williams had been brilliant, reckless, and utterly convinced that something remarkable lived in these mountains. The creature on the footage stood nearly 8 feet tall, its muscular frame covered in coarse, dark fur that rippled with each calculated movement. But it was the eyes that destroyed her scientific skepticism, pale blue human eyes that she recognized set in an elongated canine skull that belonged in nightmares. Sarah pushed back from the laptop and walked to the cabin's single window, pressing her palms against the cold glass. The burial ground lay somewhere beyond the tree line, invisible in the pre-dawn darkness but burned into her memory from years of returning to this cursed place. She'd told herself these annual pilgrimages were about closure, about honoring Marcus's memory. The truth was messier. She'd never stopped believing he was alive, somewhere in these endless mountains, waiting for her to find him. Her phone buzzed against the wooden table. A text from her department head at the University of North Carolina, Sarah. Board meeting moved to Friday. Need your bear migration data by Thursday. Hope you're finding what you're looking for up there. Dr. Patricia Vance had been her mentor for 15 years, had helped Sarah rebuild her career after Marcus's disappearance, had never once suggested that Sarah's annual research trips to Mount Mitchell were anything other than legitimate fieldwork. The bear migration study was real enough. Sarah had published 3 papers on the subject, but it was also perfect cover for her true purpose. She scrolled through her contacts until she found Marcus's parents' number. She'd called them every year on the anniversary, and they'd grown to expect it, though the conversations had become shorter and more painful with time. His mother still believed he'd simply walked away from his life, unable to handle the pressure of his doctoral program. His father had died 3 years ago, still convinced his son had fallen into one of the mountain's countless ravines. Neither of them knew about the other disappearances. Sarah opened her laptop and pulled up the files she'd been compiling for over a decade. 17 people had vanished in the Mount Mitchell area since 1995, all of them during October or November, all of them in a rough circle around the Cherokee burial ground. The local authorities blamed the terrain, treacherous cliffs, sudden weather changes, bears protecting winter dens. But Sarah had studied the patterns, had interviewed families, had spent thousands of hours mapping the disappearances against lunar cycles, weather patterns, and migration routes. The pattern was there, undeniable to anyone willing to look. Something was taking people from this mountain, and now she had proof that at least one of them had survived the experience. She thought about the government research station she'd glimpsed through binoculars last month, hidden deep in a restricted section of the national forest. The official maps showed nothing, but Sarah had spent enough time in these mountains to know when something didn't belong. The facility was new, heavily fenced, and completely off-limits to civilian researchers like herself. Marcus had mentioned something in his final journal entry, something about federal interest in local folklore that had excited him beyond reason. Sarah had assumed it was another of his conspiracy theories, the same paranoid thinking that had led him to believe the university was suppressing his cryptid research. Now she wondered if Marcus had been closer to the truth than anyone realized. The thermal camera's memory card sat on the table like a loaded weapon. In 12 hours of footage, she had 37 seconds that would either destroy her career or change everything humanity believed about the natural world. The creature, Marcus, had looked directly at her camera and spoken her name. Not a random vocalization, not pareidolia or wishful thinking, but deliberate communication from something that should have been impossible. Dawn was still 3 hours away, but Sarah knew she wouldn't sleep. She had a choice to make: report her findings through proper channels and watch them disappear into bureaucratic limbo, or investigate the truth herself and risk becoming the 18th person to vanish from Mount Mitchell. She looked at the memory card again, remembering the intelligence in those familiar blue eyes, the desperate recognition in that distorted voice. Marcus was trying to tell her something, and after 12 years of searching, she finally had a lead to follow, even if it led straight into the heart of whatever darkness had claimed him. The shrill alarm on Sarah's phone cut through the pre-dawn silence at precisely 5:47 a.m., the same time she'd awakened every morning for the past 12 years. Her body had learned to anticipate the sound, jolting her from whatever restless dreams had managed to find her in the 3 hours since she'd finally collapsed onto the cabin's narrow cot. She sat up slowly, her joints protesting the mountain cold and the unforgiving mattress. The laptop still glowed on the table, the frozen frame of Marcus's transformed face casting eerie shadows across the cabin walls. Sarah had fallen asleep staring at it, trying to reconcile the creature in the footage with her memories of the gangly graduate student who'd shared her passion for the unknown. Her morning routine was automatic, carved from years of solitary fieldwork. Coffee first, dark roast from the thermos she'd brought from Chapel Hill because the local gas station brew tasted like dishwater. Then a protein bar that claimed to taste like chocolate, but reminded her of cardboard, followed by a methodical check of her equipment. Battery levels, memory cards, lens cleaning, GPS calibration. The familiar ritual usually centered her, but today her hands trembled as she handled each device. Her phone buzzed with the first of many interruptions that would tether her to the ordinary world she'd left behind. A text from her graduate assistant, Dr. Chen. "Jenkins is freaking out about his thesis defense. Says you promised to review Chapter 3 before you left." Sarah closed her eyes. James Jenkins, 24 years old, and convinced his research on salamander populations would revolutionize conservation biology. She'd seen that same desperate optimism in Marcus, that unshakable belief that science could unlock any mystery. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd built a career studying what was known and documented while spending every spare moment chasing shadows. Another buzz. This time her sister Linda, Mom's asking about Thanksgiving again. She's making the reservation for 6 people. "Assuming you're bringing someone this year. Please say yes. She started talking about setting you up with her book club president." Sarah almost laughed. Her mother had given up hope of grandchildren years ago, but she refused to accept that her eldest daughter preferred the company of research data to potential romantic partners. How could Sarah explain that she'd left her heart in these mountains 12 years ago, that every relationship since had felt like betrayal? She scrolled through 17 missed emails from colleagues, students, and the university administration. Dr. Vance had forwarded 3 funding proposals that needed Sarah's input. The journal Wildlife Biology wanted her to peer review a paper on apex predator behavior. The North Carolina Wildlife Commission was requesting her expertise on a bear attack in Asheville. Normal life, pulling her back toward civilization like gravity. Sarah walked to the window and watched the sun struggle through the perpetual mist that shrouded Mount Mitchell. Down in Chapel Hill, her office waited with its neat stacks of research papers and photographs of receiving academic awards. Her townhouse sat empty except for her elderly cat, Winston, who was being spoiled by her neighbor, Mrs. Patterson. The refrigerator would be full of the healthy meals she batch-cooked every Sunday, the kind of organized existence that had earned her tenure and respect but felt increasingly hollow. Her colleagues saw Dr. Sarah Chen as methodical, brilliant, slightly obsessive about her research but utterly reliable. They knew she'd lost a research partner years ago and that it had affected her deeply, but they didn't know she'd been slowly dying inside ever since. They didn't know that she volunteered for every field assignment that might bring her closer to these mountains, or that she'd turned down job offers from prestigious universities that would take her too far from North Carolina. The thermal camera sat accusingly on the table, its memory card containing evidence that would either vindicate 12 years of searching or destroy the carefully constructed life she'd built from the ashes of that night. Her phone rang. Dr. Vance's number. Sarah. I hope I'm not calling too early. I know you're probably already tracking bears or whatever it is you do up there at ungodly hours. Patricia's voice was warm, concerned in the way of someone who'd watched Sarah rebuild herself from grief. She was the closest thing Sarah had to family at the university, the mentor who'd guided her through the aftermath of Marcus's disappearance and never asked too many questions about her annual pilgrimages. You're not disturbing anything, Sarah said, surprised by how normal her voice sounded. Good. Listen, I had coffee with Dean Morrison yesterday. He mentioned the Whitmore Foundation is looking for a new research director. Full autonomy, unlimited funding, based in Research Triangle. I may have mentioned your name. Sarah's stomach tightened. The Whitmore Foundation was every wildlife biologist's dream. Prestige, resources, the kind of position that would cement her legacy in the field. Patricia, you don't have to decide now. But Sarah, you're 45 years old and one of the most respected researchers in your field. You can't spend the rest of your career chasing ghosts. The words hit harder than Patricia could have known. Sarah stared at Marcus's face on the screen, at the intelligence burning in those impossible eyes. Some ghosts, Sarah whispered, turn out to be real. What did you say? Patricia's voice sharpened with concern. Sarah, you sound strange. Are you feeling all right up there? Sarah realized she'd spoken the words aloud. Her mentor's question hung in the static-filled connection, while Sarah stared at the frozen image on her laptop screen. She could lie, deflect, make some excuse about bears and research fatigue. It would be easy to slip back into the careful performance she'd maintained for 12 years. Patricia, what if I told you I found something? Something that changes everything we think we know about wildlife in these mountains. A pause. Sarah could practically hear Patricia choosing her words carefully, the way she did when dealing with students who'd become too invested in fringe theories. I'd say that you're one of the most careful researchers I know, and if you think you've made a discovery, then it deserves proper investigation. But Sarah, you're also someone who's been carrying a tremendous burden for a very long time. Sometimes our minds show us what we need to see. The gentle dismissal stung, because it was exactly what Sarah would have said to any colleague making similar claims. Before last night, she'd have agreed completely. Before she'd seen Marcus's eyes looking back at her from a creature that shouldn't exist. I need to send you something, Sarah said suddenly. Video footage. But not through university channels, not yet. Sarah, please, just look at it. Your personal email. If you think I'm losing my mind, I'll pack up today and drive back to Chapel Hill. I'll even consider the Whitmore position. Another pause, longer this time. Sarah could hear traffic in the background, the normal sounds of Patricia's commute to campus, the ordinary world, where the biggest mysteries involved grant funding and tenure reviews. All right, Patricia said finally, but I want you to promise me something. Whatever you think you've found up there, you won't do anything dangerous. No solo expeditions into restricted areas, no confronting park rangers with wild theories. If this is real, we handle it properly. Sarah's finger traced the outline of Marcus's transformed features on the screen. What if properly means it disappears forever? What if there are people who don't want this discovered? Then we deal with that when we come to it. But Sarah, if you're right about this, you can't face it alone. After ending the call, Sarah sat in the expanding silence of the cabin. Through the window, she watched a Park Service helicopter make its morning patrol sweep, the same route it had flown every day since she'd arrived. But today she noticed how it lingered over the restricted section of forest where she'd glimpsed the mysterious government facility. Her hands moved without conscious thought, transferring the 37 seconds of impossible footage to an encrypted email. She wrote only, "Patricia. This was recorded 3 nights ago at 11:47 p.m. Grid reference 35.7648 degree N, 82.265 2 degree W. Enhanced thermal imaging, no filters or editing. Watch with sound. Call me after you've seen it." The send button felt like a point of no return. Once Patricia viewed the footage, Sarah's secret investigation would become something larger, more dangerous. But keeping it hidden meant abandoning Marcus to whatever hell he'd endured for 12 years. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Dr. Chen, we need to meet. Cherokee burial ground, sunset tonight. Come alone. Trust no one else with what you found. A friend." Sarah's blood chilled. Someone knew about the footage. Someone was watching her. She grabbed the thermal camera and scrolled through the previous night's recordings, scanning for any evidence of human surveillance. Nothing obvious, but the forest held 1,000 hiding places. For 12 years, she'd assumed her searches were private, that she was just another researcher studying wildlife patterns. Now she realized how naive that had been. Her laptop chimed with an incoming call from Patricia. Too soon. The video would take at least 10 minutes to download and review. "Sarah, there's something you need to know." Patricia's voice was tight with an emotion Sarah couldn't identify. "I got a call this morning from someone claiming to be with the Department of the Interior. They asked specifically about your research location, wanted to know if you'd reported any unusual findings. What did you tell them?" "Nothing, because I don't talk to government officials without proper credentials and written requests." "But Sarah, they knew details about your work that aren't in any published papers. They knew about Marcus." Sarah felt the walls of her ordinary world crumbling completely. The offer from the Whitmore Foundation, the mysterious text, government interest, none of it was coincidence. "Download the video," she said quietly. "Watch it all the way through. Then decide if you think I'm crazy." As she ended the call, Sarah realized she was no longer just choosing between revealing the truth and protecting her career. Someone else was making moves in this game, and she was already several steps behind. She had until sunset to decide whether to meet her mysterious contact or run back to the safety of Chapel Hill. But looking at Marcus's transformed face on the screen, she knew there was really no choice at all. The call to adventure had already begun. Sarah sat motionless after ending the call, her hands trembling around the silent phone. The cabin felt smaller now, its walls pressing in like the boundaries of a trap she'd walked into blindly. Through the window, that same helicopter made another pass, and she found herself wondering if the pilot was looking for her specifically. The smart thing, the sane thing, would be to pack immediately. Drive straight back to Chapel Hill, accept the Whitmore Foundation position, and spend the rest of her career studying documented species in climate-controlled laboratories. She could have the life Patricia envisioned for her. Prestigious, safe, predictable. She could stop sleeping on narrow cots in mountain cabins and start sleeping in her own bed, surrounded by the comfortable illusions of civilization. Marcus's eyes haunted the screen, and Sarah couldn't escape the terrible knowledge that abandoning him now would be the second greatest betrayal of her life. The first had been leaving him alone in these mountains 12 years ago. She pulled up the university faculty directory on her laptop, scrolling past familiar faces until she found her own professional headshot. Dr. Sarah Chen, Associate Professor of Wildlife Biology, stared back with confident eyes and a carefully neutral expression. The woman in that photograph published papers, attended conferences and maintained professional relationships, built on mutual respect and shared methodology. That woman would never chase cryptids or entertain conspiracy theories about government cover-ups. But that woman was also dying slowly, suffocating under the weight of unasked questions and unfinished business. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from the unknown number. They're monitoring university communications. Use secure channels only. Your partner isn't the only one who's been transformed. Sarah's breath caught others. How many people had vanished into whatever nightmare Marcus had endured? How many families were still waiting for answers that would never come through official channels? She thought about her own family. Her mother planning Thanksgiving dinners for absent children, her sister Linda managing everyone's expectations with practiced efficiency. They'd learned to work around Sarah's obsessions, accommodating her annual disappearances the way families learn to navigate around addiction or chronic illness. They loved her, but they'd given up trying to understand her. What would happen to them if she vanished tonight? Would they wait 12 years the way she'd waited for Marcus, or would they eventually accept that some people simply walk away from their lives? The thought of her mother's confused grief, of Linda having to manage the aftermath, made Sarah's chest tighten with guilt. But the alternative, pretending she'd never seen the footage, never received the mysterious messages, felt like murder. Marcus had looked directly at her camera and spoken her name. He was trying to communicate something urgent, something that might save other people from sharing his fate. Sarah opened a new browser window and began researching the mysterious caller who'd contacted Patricia. The Department of the Interior had dozens of subsidiaries, any of which could legitimately inquire about research in national forest areas. But the specific knowledge about Marcus suggested something else: surveillance, investigation, or worse. She pulled up her files on the government facility she'd glimpsed last month. Officially, that section of forest was closed for geological survey work, but Sarah had seen no evidence of drilling equipment or soil samples. Instead, she'd observed regular helicopter flights, armed security patrols, and what looked like laboratory buildings concealed beneath camouflage netting. The pieces formed a picture too terrible to accept: systematic abduction, illegal experimentation, and government conspiracy spanning more than a decade. It was the kind of paranoid fantasy that destroyed academic careers and landed researchers in psychiatric evaluation programs. Except she had proof. 37 seconds of impossible footage that showed her missing research partner transformed into something beyond scientific classification. Her laptop chimed with an encrypted message from Patricia. "Sarah, what in God's name is this? I've watched it 20 times. The thermal signature readings, the bone structure analysis, the vocal pattern recognition, it's all impossible. But it's also definitely real. We need to involve the authorities immediately." Sarah typed back quickly, "No. Someone's already watching us. Government contact this morning proves it. Meeting my source tonight. If something happens to me, take the footage to Channel 11 News in Charlotte. Ask for investigative reporter Jake Morrison. He covered the missing persons cases in 2018. Sarah, you can't be serious. This isn't a movie. If there's really a government conspiracy, meeting some anonymous contact will get you killed." Patricia's response embodied everything Sarah had trained herself to value: caution, procedure, institutional protection. But institutions hadn't saved Marcus. Proper channels hadn't brought him home. 12 years of following protocol had produced nothing but academic papers and empty reassurances. Sarah looked at the mysterious text message again. Sunset at the Cherokee burial ground, the same location where Marcus had vanished, where her thermal cameras had recorded the impossible footage. Someone wanted her to complete the circle, to return to the place where everything had begun. Her career, her safety, her carefully reconstructed life, all of it balanced against the desperate intelligence in Marcus's transformed eyes. The sun was already declining toward the western peaks. She had 6 hours to decide whether she was Dr. Sarah Chen, respected researcher and cautious academic, or the woman who'd never stopped believing that impossible things were hiding in these ancient mountains. The choice felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness. Sarah stared at her phone for a full minute after reading Patricia's message, watching the cursor blink in the empty reply field. 6 hours until sunset. 6 hours to abandon everything she'd built since Marcus disappeared, or abandon Marcus himself to whatever hell he'd endured for 12 years. She stood and walked to the cabin's small mirror, studying her reflection as if seeing herself for the first time. 45 years old, graying at the temples despite her Korean jeans' laugh lines that had deepened into permanent creases of worry. The face of a woman who'd spent half her life in careful stasis, maintaining the illusion of moving forward while remaining fundamentally frozen in place. "What would you do, Marcus?" she whispered to her reflection. But she already knew the answer. Marcus had never hesitated when someone needed help. He'd have walked into those mountains alone if necessary, government conspiracy or not. Sarah returned to her laptop and began typing a response to Patricia that felt like writing her own obituary. "If you don't hear from me by midnight, contact Jake Morrison. Tell him about the missing persons cases, the government facility coordinates I sent you last month, and the connection to the 2011 disappearances. Promise me you'll do this, Patricia." Whatever happens tonight, Marcus can't stay lost. She hit send before she could reconsider. The simple act of committing to the meeting shifted something fundamental in her chest. For 12 years, she'd lived suspended between hope and despair, never fully accepting Marcus's death, but never truly believing in his survival. Now she had proof he existed in some form, and that knowledge demanded action regardless of consequences. Sarah began methodically packing her gear: thermal camera, GPS unit, emergency beacon, first aid kit. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency while her mind raced through everything that could go wrong. The mysterious contact could be government agents planning to silence her. It could be a trap designed to add her to the list of missing persons, but it could also be someone with answers. Someone who'd been waiting 12 years for a researcher brave enough or stupid enough to document the truth. She sealed the original memory card containing Marcus's footage in a waterproof container and hid it behind the cabin's loose baseboard. If something happened to her tonight, the backup copies she'd sent to Patricia might be the only evidence that survived. Her phone rang, startling her from the grim preparations. Linda's name appeared on the screen, and Sarah felt a stab of panic. Her sister's timing was always impeccable in the worst possible way. "Hey," Sarah answered, forcing normalcy into her voice. "Mom wanted me to call. She's worried because you haven't returned her texts about Thanksgiving plans. Are you bringing someone this year, or should we set one place at the table?" The mundane question, the same one Linda asked every October, suddenly felt surreal. In 6 hours, Sarah might be dead or disappeared, and her family was planning holiday seating arrangements. "Just me," Sarah said, wondering if she was lying. "You know, there's this doctor at the hospital, divorced, no kids, loves hiking. Mom thinks, Linda, not now." Sarah's voice came out sharper than intended. A pause. "Sarah, you sound weird. Are you okay up there?" The concern in her sister's voice nearly broke Sarah's resolve. Linda had spent their entire lives cleaning up emotional messes, mediating between Sarah and their parents, explaining Sarah's absences and obsessions to worried relatives, managing everyone's expectations around Sarah's annual mountain pilgrimages. She deserved to know that tonight might be different, that this time Sarah might not come home. "I love you," Sarah said instead. "Tell Mom I love her too, okay? Whatever happens, remember that. Jesus, Sarah, you're scaring me. What's going on? Are you having some kind of breakdown up there?" "I'm fine. Just thinking about Marcus. You know how I get this time of year." Another pause. Linda had been there for the worst of Sarah's grief, had held her through the nightmares and panic attacks that followed Marcus's disappearance. She knew the signs of Sarah's PTSD, could read her sister's emotional state through subtle voice cues. "Do you want me to drive up? I can get coverage for my shift." "No." Sarah's voice was firm. "I need to do this alone." "Do what alone?" "Sarah, you're freaking me out." Sarah closed her eyes, memorizing the sound of her sister's voice. "Linda, you're the best sister anyone could ask for. Take care of Mom, okay?" She ended the call before Linda could respond, then turned off the phone completely. Whatever happened at the Cherokee burial ground, her family couldn't be involved. The sun was touching the western peaks now, painting the mountains in shades of amber and gold. Sarah checked her gear one final time, secured her backup footage files, and stepped outside into the October air. The helicopter was nowhere to be seen, but she felt watched nonetheless, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. At the edge of the forest, Sarah paused and looked back at the cabin that had sheltered her searches for over a decade. Tomorrow, someone else might be sleeping in that narrow cot, pursuing different mysteries or simply enjoying a weekend retreat. The thought should have filled her with regret. Instead, she felt free. Sarah Chen, careful researcher and cautious academic, stayed behind as she walked into the darkening woods. The woman who emerged moved with purpose toward answers that might destroy her, carrying hope that had survived 12 years of disappointment. There was no going back now. The forest path felt different beneath Sarah's boots, each step carrying her deeper into territory that no longer belonged to the ordinary world. Shadows stretched like grasping fingers between the trees, and the October air carried sounds she couldn't identify, rustlings that might be wind or might be something watching her passage. Sarah checked her GPS. The Cherokee burial ground lay another mile ahead, up a steep switchback trail that Marcus had helped clear during their first research season. She remembered his excitement that day, how he'd insisted the ancient site might hold clues to local wildlife migration patterns. Now she wondered if he'd sensed something else entirely, some primordial warning that drew him back again and again until it finally claimed him. A branch snapped somewhere to her left. Sarah froze, thermal camera already in her hands, scanning the dense undergrowth for heat signatures. Nothing, but the forest had gone unnaturally quiet, as if every living creature was holding its breath. Dr. Chen. The voice came from behind a massive oak, calm and surprisingly young. A woman stepped into view, mid-30s, wearing hiking gear that looked both expensive and well-used. She moved with the careful balance of someone who'd spent serious time in rough terrain. "You came alone." "Good." The stranger's eyes were sharp, intelligent, constantly scanning their surroundings. "I'm Dr. Elena Vasquez. I worked at the facility until 3 months ago." Sarah's grip tightened on the thermal camera. "What facility?" "The one you've been watching. The one where they took your partner." Elena stepped closer, and Sarah caught the faint outline of a pistol beneath her jacket. "They call it Research Station 7. Officially, it doesn't exist. What kind of research?" Sarah's voice barely carried above a whisper. Elena pulled a tablet from her pack, its screen showing medical files and laboratory reports. "They're trying to create enhanced soldiers. Genetic modification combined with something they found in these mountains, something that existed here long before the Cherokee gave it a name." The files Elena showed her were horrifying in their clinical precision. Subject profiles with redacted names, surgical procedures that violated every principle of medical ethics, transformation protocols that pushed human physiology beyond recognition. Sarah saw X-rays of elongated bone structures, muscle density measurements that defied biological possibility, and brain scans showing neural patterns unlike anything in medical literature. "Marcus?" Sarah managed. "Subject 47. He's been their most successful. Adaptation." Elena's voice carried a weight of guilt that suggested personal involvement. "But something went wrong 6 months ago. He started retaining more human consciousness than the protocol allowed. They were planning to terminate the experiment." Sarah felt the ground shift beneath her feet. "You mean kill him?" "They've killed dozens of others. But Subject 47 escaped during a routine transport. He's been living in these mountains, trying to find a way to communicate what happened to him." The thermal footage suddenly made terrible sense. Marcus hadn't been hunting. He'd been searching for her, trying to lead her to the truth the only way he could manage with his transformed physiology. "Why are you telling me this?" Sarah asked. Elena's expression hardened. "Because I helped create that nightmare, and I can't undo it alone. But you have footage, documentation they don't know exists yet. That's evidence that could expose everything. A new sound reached them, the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. Elena's head snapped toward the approaching aircraft, her face draining of color. They found us faster than I expected. She grabbed Sarah's arm urgently. There's a cave system near the burial ground. Marcus has been using it as shelter. If we can reach him... The helicopter's searchlight swept through the trees, still distant but closing rapidly. Elena pulled Sarah off the main trail, plunging them into thick underbrush that tore at their clothes and equipment. Behind them, the aircraft's engine noise grew louder, joined by the fainter sounds of vehicles on forest roads. "How many people know about this?" Sarah gasped as they climbed toward the burial ground. "Too many to contain quietly, but not enough to stop them if we disappear tonight." Elena paused at a fallen log, checking their back trail. "They've been monitoring your research for years, waiting to see if you'd find anything significant. Your thermal footage triggered automatic surveillance protocols." Sarah realized with growing horror that her careful documentation had painted a target on her back. Every published paper, every research grant, every night spent alone in these mountains, all of it had been observed and catalogued by people who saw her obsession as a potential threat. The burial ground appeared ahead, ancient stones barely visible in the gathering darkness. But Elena led them past it toward a crack in the mountainside that Sarah had never noticed despite years of searching this area. "Marcus!" Elena called softly into the cave opening. A responding sound emerged from the depths, not quite human but unmistakably intelligent. Sarah's heart hammered as she realized she was about to see her research partner for the first time in 12 years, transformed into something that existed at the intersection of science and nightmare. The helicopter's searchlight found them just as they reached the cave entrance. The blazing white light pinned them like specimens as Elena shoved Sarah toward the cave opening. "Move! Now!" Sarah stumbled into the darkness, her heart pounding so violently she could barely hear Elena's shouted instructions behind her. The cave mouth swallowed them, cutting off the helicopter's roar to a distant throb that vibrated through stone walls older than human memory. "Lights off," Elena hissed, grabbing Sarah's thermal camera before she could activate it. "They have infrared tracking. Stay close and follow my voice." They pressed deeper into the mountain's belly, Elena's hand guiding Sarah through passages that seemed impossibly narrow one moment and cathedral vast the next. The air grew thick with mineral scents and something else, a musky, wild odor that raised primitive warnings in Sarah's hindbrain. Behind them, combat boots echoed off stone as tactical teams entered the cave system. Radio chatter filtered through the tunnels, clipped voices coordinating search patterns with military precision. "This way," Elena whispered, pulling Sarah down a side passage so low they had to crawl. "There's a larger chamber ahead. Marcus found it months ago. The thermal signatures confuse their equipment." Sarah's knees scraped against rough stone as they navigated the crawl space, her pack catching on every protrusion. 12 years of careful academic distance had left her unprepared for this desperate scramble through mountain depths, chased by people who saw her as a problem requiring permanent solution. The passage opened into a space that felt vast in the absolute darkness. Elena's hand found Sarah's shoulder, steadying her as she struggled to make sense of their surroundings. "Marcus?" Elena called again, barely audible. The responding sound came from everywhere and nowhere, a low rumble that might have been vocal cords attempting human speech, or something far more alien trying to mimic familiar patterns. Sarah felt her scientific training war with primal terror as massive footsteps approached through the darkness. "It's okay," Elena murmured, though her voice carried its own tremor of uncertainty. "He knows you. He's been waiting." A hand touched Sarah's face in the blackness, fingers that felt wrong, too long and tipped with something harder than human nails. But the touch was gentle, almost reverent, and when warm breath brushed her cheek, she caught the faintest whisper of her name, spoken in a voice she'd once known better than her own. "Marcus." The word escaped as half sob, half prayer. The creature, no, the man, still a man despite everything, made another sound, urgent and complex. Elena seemed to understand, responding in hushed tones that carried the rhythm of established communication. He says they're coming through the main passages. 3 teams, maybe more. But there's another way out, deeper in the system. It connects to old Cherokee ceremonial caves that predate any government surveys. Elena! Sarah's voice cracked with the weight of impossible questions. What did they do to him? Before Elena could respond, Marcus moved again, his transformed hand finding Sarah's and pressing something cold and metallic into her palm. A USB drive. Somehow, despite his altered physiology, he'd managed to preserve and protect this small piece of evidence. My God, Elena breathed as Sarah's fingers closed around the device. He's been documenting everything, every procedure, every experiment, every person they've taken. The sound of approaching boots grew louder, accompanied by the mechanical whine of scanning equipment. Red laser dots began dancing across the cave walls as tactical teams closed their search perimeter. Marcus made a decision that required no translation. His massive form moved between Sarah and the cave mouth, blocking any direct line of sight while Elena grabbed Sarah's pack and pulled her toward the deeper passages. No! Sarah fought against Elena's grip. I'm not leaving him again. He's buying us time, Elena said fiercely. Don't waste what he's giving you. Through the darkness, Sarah heard Marcus begin to vocalize, not the desperate whispers he'd managed for her, but something primal and challenging that echoed through the cave system like a war cry. The sound triggered immediate chaos among the search teams, their disciplined advance dissolving into panicked shouts and automatic weapons fire. Elena dragged Sarah deeper into the mountain as gunfire strobed behind them, each muzzle flash revealing glimpses of impossible anatomy moving with predatory grace through the darkness. Marcus wasn't just hiding anymore. He was hunting the people who'd destroyed his humanity. The ceremonial caves, Elena gasped as they ran through passages that seemed to stretch infinitely ahead. If we can reach them, there are exit points they don't know about. Sacred sites the Cherokee never mapped for outsiders. Sarah clutched the USB drive like a lifeline, her academic mind already cataloging the evidence it might contain, while her heart shattered with each distant gunshot. Marcus had waited 12 years for this moment, had preserved his human intelligence through unimaginable transformation, specifically to put this proof in her hands. Behind them, the gunfire stopped abruptly, replaced by something far more terrifying. Absolute silence that suggested Marcus had accomplished his objective with ruthless efficiency. They had their evidence. Now they had to survive long enough to use it. The silence stretched behind them like a held breath, broken only by the harsh rasp of their breathing as Elena pulled Sarah through passages that seemed to narrow with each desperate step. The USB drive felt impossibly heavy in Sarah's grip, a small piece of technology that contained the power to topple governments and expose horrors that violated every principle of human decency. Keep moving, Elena whispered, her voice tight with exhaustion and fear. The ceremonial chambers are close. Sarah's legs trembled with fatigue and shock. Everything she'd believed about Marcus's disappearance, about the nature of scientific research, about her own safety, all of it had crumbled in the span of hours. The man she'd mourned for 12 years was alive, transformed into something that existed between human and monster, and somewhere behind them in those dark passages, he'd just killed government agents to protect evidence of crimes she was only beginning to comprehend. Elena. Sarah's voice cracked. What Marcus became, is it reversible? The pause before Elena answered told Sarah everything she needed to know. The genetic modifications are permanent. The neural restructuring, we don't know how to undo what was done to higher brain functions. But he's still in there, Sarah. More than any of us expected possible. They emerged into a chamber that felt different from the rough cave passages. Smoother walls carved with symbols that predated European contact with these mountains. Elena pulled out a small penlight, its beam revealing intricate Cherokee pictographs depicting ceremonies Sarah recognized from her anthropological training. Sacred burial chamber, Sarah breathed, her academic instincts momentarily overriding terror. This is where they brought chiefs and medicine men for final rites. And where the Cherokee first encountered what your government turned into a weapon. Elena's light found more pictographs, these showing human figures transforming into creatures that looked disturbingly familiar. It wasn't created in a laboratory, Sarah. It was found here, in these mountains, something that's existed for generations, maybe centuries. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. The research facility hadn't created the transformation. They'd weaponized something ancient, something the Cherokee had encountered and ultimately learned to contain through ritual and respect. Marcus and the other subjects hadn't been enhanced. They'd been infected with something that was never meant to spread beyond these mountain peaks. The missing persons reports, Sarah said, understanding flooding through her. All those hikers, all those families who disappeared over the decades. Test subjects. They've been harvesting people from these mountains for years, using isolated disappearances to perfect their process. Elena's voice carried the weight of complicity and regret. I thought we were advancing human evolution. I didn't realize we were just feeding an ancient horror. Footsteps echoed from the passage behind them, heavy, measured steps that didn't sound entirely human. Sarah's heart lurched, but Elena actually relaxed slightly. Marcus found us, she said with relief. The figure that emerged from the darkness challenged every assumption Sarah had built about the boundaries between human and animal. Marcus stood nearly 7 feet tall, his frame elongated and powerful in ways that human bone structure shouldn't accommodate. His face retained enough familiar features that she could recognize the man she'd once known, but everything else spoke of forced evolution guided by scientific ambition rather than natural selection. When he looked at her, though, his eyes held the intelligence and warmth she remembered. He was still Marcus, brilliant, caring, protective Marcus, trapped inside a form that represented humanity's capacity for monstrous overreach. He approached slowly, careful not to startle her, and Sarah found herself stepping forward to meet him halfway. When their transformed and unchanged hands touched, she felt the 12-year gap collapse into irrelevance. The evidence, Marcus said, his voice a careful construction around vocal cords that had been redesigned for different purposes. You must expose this. Stop them from taking others. Sarah held up the USB drive. I will. I promise. Marcus nodded, then turned to Elena with an expression that carried urgent warning. They're regrouping, calling reinforcements. This place, they'll destroy it rather than let evidence survive. The exit tunnels? Elena asked. Compromised. They've mapped more than we thought possible. Marcus looked back at Sarah with something like apology. Only one way out that stays secret. He led them to a section of the ceremonial chamber where ancient pictographs gave way to natural cave formations. Behind a cluster of stalactites, water trickled down a steep passage that disappeared into absolute darkness. Underground river, Marcus explained, flows out past their perimeter. Cherokee used it for sacred pilgrimages. Sarah stared at the narrow, water-filled passage and felt her greatest fear crystallize. Not the fear of dying. She'd accepted that possibility when she'd first decided to document the Dogman. Not even the fear of what Marcus had become, because love had proven stronger than horror. Her greatest fear was failing. Letting Marcus's sacrifice, Elena's courage, and the suffering of dozens of victims disappear into government denial and cover-up. The USB drive contained evidence that could prevent future atrocities, but only if she survived to expose it. The sound of explosives echoed through the mountain as tactical teams began systematically destroying cave passages behind them. They were out of time, and Sarah was out of choices. She sealed the USB drive in her waterproof equipment case and stepped into the frigid mountain water, following Marcus into darkness that would either carry them to safety or become their tomb. The ordeal had truly begun. The underground river was a nightmare of ice and stone that swallowed them into absolute blackness. Sarah's breath came in sharp gasps as the frigid water rose to her chest, each step forward a battle against currents, that seemed determined to drag her into the mountain's depths. The waterproof case containing the USB drive banged against her ribs with each movement, a constant reminder that everything depended on keeping that small piece of evidence intact. Marcus moved ahead of them with fluid grace, his transformed physiology adapting to conditions that pushed Sarah and Elena to their physical limits. The passage narrowed until they were forced to duck-walk through spaces barely wide enough for human shoulders, the ceiling so low that Sarah's face occasionally brushed against limestone that wept mineral tears. How much further? Elena gasped behind her, the words echoing strangely off wet stone. Marcus's response was a low rumble that carried notes of uncertainty. Even he wasn't sure about the passage's endpoint. They were following Cherokee memory and desperate hope through a route that might not lead to safety at all. The water deepened suddenly, forcing them to swim through a section where the ceiling dropped to mere inches above the surface. Sarah's equipment case became a dead weight that threatened to pull her under with each stroke. The waterproof seals held, but for how long? The USB drive inside represented the only evidence that could expose decades of government atrocities, and she was dragging it through conditions that would destroy most electronic equipment. When they finally reached a section where they could stand again, Sarah's relief lasted only seconds. The passage split into 3 separate channels, each disappearing into darkness that offered no clues about which route led to freedom and which to death. Marcus studied the options with visible frustration. Cherokee stories speak of 3 paths. 2 lead to sacred pools. 1 leads to the world beyond. You don't know which is which? Sarah's voice cracked with exhaustion and growing panic. Stories were lost when they took me. 12 years of memories fragmenting. Sarah felt the weight of impossible choice settling on her shoulders. Behind them, the distant sound of explosives continued as government teams destroyed evidence of their crimes, along with any chance of retreat. Ahead lay 3 paths, only one of which offered escape. Elena was studying her handheld GPS unit, its screen flickering weakly in the cave's electromagnetic interference. The readings are chaos down here. Mineral deposits are creating false signals, and we're too deep for satellite contact. That was when Sarah realized the full scope of their trap. The government teams didn't need to catch them, they just needed to contain them long enough for the mountain to do their work. These passages could stretch for miles, branching into dozens of dead ends that would leave them lost until exhaustion or hypothermia claimed their lives. The USB drive evidence would disappear with them, its revelations dying in Cherokee sacred waters that would become their tomb. We split up, Sarah decided, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Cover more ground, increase our chances. No. Marcus's transformed features twisted with desperate urgency. Too dangerous. If we choose wrong. If we stay together and choose wrong, everyone dies, and the evidence dies with us. Sarah sealed the equipment case more securely to her chest. This is bigger than any of us. Those test subjects, the missing persons, the families who never got answers, they deserve better than watching us fail because we couldn't take calculated risks. Elena was already studying the middle passage, her scientific training asserting itself despite their desperate circumstances. The water flow is slightly stronger here. That might indicate a more direct route to an outlet. But as she moved toward the passage, her foot slipped on moss-slicked stone. Elena's arms windmilled frantically as she fought for balance, her equipment pack swinging wide. The motion sent her crashing into Sarah, who stumbled backward into the rushing water. Sarah's head struck an outcropping of limestone with a sickening crack. Stars exploded across her vision as she felt her grip on the equipment case loosen. The waterproof container that held their only evidence slipped from her numbing fingers and disappeared into the dark current. No. Sarah lunged after it, but the case had already been swept into one of the passages. She couldn't tell which one. Marcus caught her before she could follow it into potentially fatal waters, his powerful grip the only thing preventing her from drowning in pursuit of evidence that was now lost to Cherokee sacred waters. Gone, Sarah whispered, the word carrying the weight of complete defeat. It's gone. 12 years of searching, Marcus's impossible transformation, Elena's desperate betrayal of her former employers, the sacrifice of government agents who'd been killed in the cave battle, all of it rendered meaningless by a slip on wet stone and her own failing grip. The mountain had claimed the evidence, and with it, any hope of exposing the atrocities that had cost so many lives. They were trapped in darkness with nothing left but the slim chance of survival that seemed increasingly meaningless without the proof that had brought them together. All was lost. The silence that followed Sarah's whispered. It's gone, stretched like a living thing, heavy with despair and the weight of impossible loss. Marcus's grip on her arm was the only thing anchoring her to reality as the dark water continued its relentless flow, carrying their evidence deeper into the mountain's bowels. But then Elena was moving, her hands frantically searching the limestone walls where the passages diverged. Her penlight beam danced across wet stone as she traced patterns in the rock that Sarah had dismissed as natural formations. "Wait," Elena breathed, her voice cutting through Sarah's devastation. "Look at this. Really look." The light revealed carved symbols, not the ancient Cherokee pictographs they'd seen in the ceremonial chamber, but something else. Something that made Marcus's transformed features shift with recognition and growing understanding. "These marks," Elena continued, her scientific training overriding despair. "They're not random, they're directional indicators, and they're fresh. Maybe weeks old, not centuries." Sarah forced herself to focus despite the crushing weight of their loss. The symbols were crude but deliberate, scratch marks in groups of 3, with arrows pointing toward the leftmost passage. Below them, barely visible unless you knew what to look for, were initials carved with desperate precision into the stone. MR plus SC, Marcus Reed and Sarah Chen. "You did this," Sarah whispered, staring at Marcus with dawning amazement. "During your time in the caves, you've been preparing for this moment, mapping escape routes and marking them for—" She paused, the full implication hitting her. "For me. You always believed I'd come back." Marcus's response was a low rumble that carried notes of confession and hope. 12 years of planning, waiting, knowing that if anyone could expose the truth, it would be you. But Elena was already moving deeper into the leftmost passage, her light revealing more markers carved into the stone at regular intervals. "There's more," she called back, excitement building in her voice. "Marcus, you brilliant bastard! There's more!" They followed the marked passage for 50 yards before Elena's light illuminated something that made Sarah's heart stop. A waterproof case identical to the one she'd lost sat wedged securely between 2 limestone formations, positioned where the current couldn't reach it, but where someone following the markers would inevitably find it. "Backup," Marcus explained as Sarah stared in disbelief. "Made copies of everything, multiple caches throughout the cave system. Government thinks they're hunting one man hiding evidence they don't understand. Systematic preparation." Sarah's hands shook as she opened the case. Inside were not just USB drives, multiple drives, each labeled with dates spanning years, but also handwritten documentation, photographs, and samples preserved in specialized containers. Marcus hadn't just been documenting his own transformation. He'd been conducting a comprehensive investigation from within the facility, gathering evidence that no outside researcher could ever access. "The missing persons," Sarah said, scanning pages of Marcus's careful handwriting. "You documented every subject they brought in, names, dates, family information, the progression of experiments. And the ones who died," Elena added grimly, reading over Sarah's shoulder. "The failed attempts, the subjects who didn't survive the process, the cover-ups when families got too persistent in their searching." But it was the final set of documents that made Sarah's breath catch. Government correspondence, discussing facility closure, evidence destruction, and the permanent neutralization of remaining assets, including Marcus himself. "They're not trying to recapture you," Sarah realized, looking at Marcus with horror. "They're here to eliminate everyone who knows the truth. You, Elena, me, we're all liabilities now." Marcus nodded grimly. Facility was always temporary. Once they perfected the process, witnesses become dangerous. The sound of rushing water suddenly changed pitch, becoming deeper and more resonant. Elena's light revealed that they'd reached a larger chamber, where the underground river opened into something approaching a natural cathedral. But more importantly, pale light filtered down from somewhere high above, not artificial illumination but the grey promise of dawn breaking over the Appalachian peaks. "Exits above us," Marcus said, pointing to where handholds had been carved into the chamber wall. "Leads to Cherokee sacred site, 3 miles from government perimeter." As they prepared for the climb that would carry them to safety and the chance to expose the truth, Sarah realized that her greatest fear hadn't been failure after all. It had been the possibility that Marcus's sacrifice would be meaningless, that his transformation and suffering would disappear into government denial. But looking at the evidence they now carried, evidence that could topple administrations and save countless future victims, Sarah understood that Marcus had transformed his curse into purpose. Every day of his captivity, every moment of his changed existence, had been preparation for this revelation. The mountain had taken 12 years from them, but it was about to give them the power to ensure those years mattered. Truth, like water, always found a way to the surface. The climb up the chamber wall tested every muscle in Sarah's body, but it was nothing compared to the weight of possibility that pressed against her chest. Dawn light grew stronger with each handhold, painting the limestone in shades of hope that felt almost foreign after so many hours of underground despair. When they finally emerged through a natural opening concealed by Cherokee stonework, Sarah found herself gasping in mountain air that tasted like freedom. They stood on a secluded ledge overlooking the Appalachian Valley, far from the government perimeter that had seemed so inescapable just hours before. Marcus moved immediately to a cache hidden beneath fitted stones, another of his preparation sites that revealed the true scope of his planning. Inside were thermal blankets, energy supplies, and most importantly, a satellite communication device that had been modified to encrypt transmissions through multiple relay points. "How long have you been preparing for this?" Sarah asked, marveling at the thoroughness of his arrangements. 12 years, Marcus replied, his transformed voice carrying notes of grim satisfaction. "Every day, every moment they thought I was broken and contained." Elena was already examining the communications equipment with professional appreciation. "This is military-grade encryption, bounced through servers that would take government agencies weeks to trace. You've been building a revelation network." Sarah opened the evidence case again, this time with steady hands and growing resolve. The documentation Marcus had compiled represented more than just proof of crimes. It was a complete exposure framework. Names of government officials, budget authorizations, facility locations, corporate partnerships with biotech companies that had provided genetic research support. "We can't just release this randomly," Sarah realized, her scientific training asserting itself. Information this explosive needs strategic distribution. Simultaneous releases to multiple news outlets, scientific journals, law enforcement agencies, and international human rights organizations. Marcus nodded approvingly. "Contact list in secondary cache. Journalists who've investigated government overreach. Scientists who will understand the implications. Legal advocates who specialize in classified revelations." As Sarah began composing encrypted messages on the satellite device, she felt the transformation that had been building within her throughout this ordeal finally solidifying. She was no longer just a wildlife biologist pursuing personal closure. She had become something more focused and dangerous, a researcher with unshakable evidence and the network to expose it properly. The first message went to Dr. Jennifer Walsh at the Washington Post, an investigative journalist who'd spent years documenting government scientific programs that operated outside ethical boundaries. The second, to Dr. Robert Kim at the International Journal of Bioethics, whose platform could reach the global scientific community. The third, to Maria Santos at the Human Rights Defense Coalition, whose legal team had successfully prosecuted government officials for crimes against civilian populations. Each message contained the same core information: evidence of unauthorized human experimentation, systematic murder disguised as missing persons cases, and the creation of biological weapons using unwilling subjects. But more importantly, each message included Marcus's location coordinates and his willingness to provide direct testimony. "They'll want to see you," Sarah told Marcus as she sent the transmissions. "Document your transformation, record your testimony, verify that you're really Marcus Reed and not some elaborate hoax." Marcus's expression grew thoughtful. 12 years of hiding ends now. Whatever happens, happens in daylight. Elena was monitoring radio frequencies on a scanner she'd retrieved from Marcus's equipment cache. Government teams are still destroying evidence at the facility, but they're also conducting systematic searches of the surrounding area. They know we escaped, and they're expanding their perimeter. Sarah felt a surge of strategic satisfaction. Let them search. Every hour they spend hunting us is another hour for our evidence to propagate through channels they can't control. By the time they locate us, the revelation will be too widespread to contain. The satellite device chimed with incoming responses. Dr. Walsh wanted immediate video conference capability. Dr. Kim was already assembling a peer review team. Maria Santos was contacting federal prosecutors who specialized in constitutional violations. But it was the fourth response that made Sarah's breath catch. From Dr. Amanda Foster at the CDC, whose division investigated biological threats to public safety. "She wants to know if the genetic modifications are contagious," Sarah read aloud. "If whatever they did to you could spread to natural populations." Marcus's transformed features went very still, unknown. They never tested for environmental transmission, only focused on weapons applications. The implications hit Sarah like a physical blow. The government facility hadn't just been creating individual weapons, they'd potentially developed a biological agent that could affect entire ecosystems. The missing persons cases, the Cherokee burial ground location, the mountains' isolation, it all suggested a testing ground for something far more catastrophic than individual transformations. "We need to get you to proper medical facilities," Sarah decided. Full biological containment, comprehensive testing, genetic analysis that determines exactly what they did and whether it poses broader risks. As they prepared to descend toward the valley, where extraction teams could safely reach them, Sarah realized that their escape was just the beginning. The real work, exposing the truth, ensuring justice, and preventing future atrocities, was about to begin in earnest. The descent from the Cherokee's sacred site should have felt like victory, but Sarah found herself moving with the methodical precision of someone entering battle rather than fleeing it. Each step down the mountain path carried them closer to a confrontation that would dwarf everything they'd already endured. Marcus had rigged emergency beacons along their route, more evidence of his 12-year preparation, and within 2 hours they could hear the distant thrum of helicopters converging on their position. But these weren't the black military aircraft that had terrorized them at the facility. These bore the markings of legitimate news organizations, federal law enforcement agencies that operated independently of the conspiracy they'd uncovered, and medical evacuation teams. "Dr. Chen?" The voice crackled through Elena's handheld radio. Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the Washington Post, speaking from the lead helicopter. "We have your evidence packets, and we have federal marshals with arrest warrants. But we need visual confirmation of your claims before we can proceed." Sarah looked at Marcus, seeing the weight of decision in his transformed features. For 12 years he'd existed as a ghost story, a legend whispered among missing persons cases and government cover-ups. Revealing himself meant abandoning any possibility of returning to the shadows. "Do it," Marcus said simply. "Finish what we started." The clearing where they chose to make their stand had once been Cherokee ceremonial ground. Elena identified the stone arrangements that marked it as a place of truth-telling and judgment. Sarah found grim appropriateness in the location as she activated the emergency beacon that would guide their allies directly to them. But as the helicopters circled overhead, her radio intercepted military communications that made her blood freeze. "Containment protocols are authorized," came the cold voice of someone high enough in the government hierarchy to order mass casualties. "Eliminate all witnesses. Attribute to terrorist action if necessary." This revelation cannot reach public consciousness. Sarah realized that their evidence distribution, rather than ensuring safety, had triggered a desperate government response. Officials who might have allowed them to disappear quietly were now prepared to murder journalists, federal marshals, and medical personnel to maintain their cover-up. "They're going to kill everyone," Sarah breathed, watching the civilian helicopters hover unknowingly above what was about to become a massacre. "Everyone who responded to help us." Elena was already working frantically with their communication equipment. "I can warn them off. Tell them to maintain distance until—" "No." Sarah's voice carried a finality that surprised even her. "Running means they win. It means every future victim dies in facilities we'll never find, while officials who authorize torture and murder retire with full pensions." Marcus moved to stand beside her, his massive form casting shadows across the ceremonial stones. "Government teams will be here in minutes. Whatever happens, happens together." Sarah felt the weight of every choice she'd made over the past 12 years settling onto her shoulders. Her obsession with finding Marcus had cost her marriage, her career stability, her peace of mind. But it had also led to this moment, the chance to prevent countless future atrocities. She opened the final evidence case and activated recording equipment that would broadcast everything directly to their media contacts. If government forces wanted to eliminate witnesses, they would do so while the world watched. "My name is Dr. Sarah Chen." She spoke clearly into the camera, her voice steady despite the approaching sound of military vehicles. 12 years ago, my research partner Marcus Reed was abducted by a government facility that has been conducting illegal human experimentation on missing persons. Today, we have documented proof of systematic torture, murder, and biological weapons development funded by taxpayer money and authorized by officials who betrayed their oaths to protect American citizens. Behind her, Marcus stepped into the camera's view. Gasps of shock came through the radio from observers in the helicopters above. His transformation was undeniable proof that the government had created horrors beyond public imagination. "I am Marcus Reed," he said, his transformed voice carrying across the clearing. "For 12 years I have been a prisoner and test subject. What you see before you is the result of genetic experimentation performed without consent, without ethical oversight, and without regard for human dignity." The sound of approaching vehicles grew louder, but Sarah felt no fear, only the crystalline clarity that came from understanding exactly what needed to be accomplished. "Whatever happens in the next few minutes," Sarah continued to the camera, "remember that truth demands courage from ordinary people. The monsters are not the creatures created by government experimentation. The monsters are the officials who authorized these crimes and the system that enabled them to continue for decades." As military vehicles burst into the clearing with weapons raised, Sarah realized that she had finally become what Marcus's disappearance had always demanded her to become. Not just a scientist seeking answers, but a witness prepared to ensure those answers survived regardless of personal cost. The final confrontation had begun, and there would be no retreat. The military vehicles formed a semicircle around the ceremonial clearing with tactical precision, weapons trained on Sarah, Marcus, and Elena from multiple angles. But Sarah kept her camera steady, broadcasting everything to the watching world above and beyond. "Cut the transmission," commanded the lead operative as he emerged from an armored vehicle, his face hidden behind tactical gear that seemed designed to ensure anonymity. "By order of national security protocols, you will cease all communication immediately." Sarah's response came not in words, but in action. She adjusted the camera angle to capture the operative's approach while continuing her narration. "What you're witnessing is the government's attempt to silence evidence of systematic human rights violations. Notice how they refuse to identify themselves, how their vehicles bear no official markings, how they operate in the shadows like the criminals they are." Everything Marcus had taught her about government intimidation tactics suddenly crystallized in her mind. The anonymous operatives, the threats couched in legal language, the assumption that ordinary citizens would submit to authority regardless of its legitimacy, it was all designed to exploit people's conditioned compliance. but 12 years of obsession had burned that compliance out of her completely. Dr. Chen. The operative's voice carried manufactured patience. You are interfering with a classified operation involving national security threats. Comply immediately or face federal prosecution. Marcus stepped forward, his transformed presence causing visible tension among the armed personnel. Several weapons shifted to target him directly, but he moved with deliberate calm that spoke of someone who had long ago accepted the possibility of death. Classified operation? Marcus's voice carried bitter amusement. You mean the torture facility that violated every Geneva Convention protocol? The one that murdered American citizens whose only crime was hiking in the wrong mountains? Elena had positioned herself to film from a different angle, ensuring that no single action could eliminate all documentation. Sarah felt fierce gratitude for the journalist's professional instincts. Elena understood that truth required multiple witnesses, multiple perspectives, multiple channels of evidence. The radio crackled with increasingly desperate communications from the helicopters above. Dr. Walsh's voice cut through the static. Federal marshals are en route to your location, Dr. Chen. Maintain your position. You have legal protection. But Sarah could see the calculation in the lead operative's posture, the way his team moved to establish crossfire positions that would eliminate everyone in the clearing. Legal protection meant nothing to people who had spent decades operating outside legal boundaries. The evidence has already been distributed, Sarah announced, her voice carrying across the clearing with scientific precision. Multiple copies, multiple networks, multiple international destinations. Killing us accomplishes nothing except adding murder to the charges you already face. The operative's response revealed everything about the government's desperation. There are no charges, Dr. Chen. There are no crimes. There is only classified research that requires protection from terrorist interference. Sarah felt something shift inside her, the final transformation from victim to prosecutor. Every skill she developed as a researcher, every technique Marcus had taught her about evidence preservation, every lesson Elena had shared about exposing institutional corruption, suddenly aligned into perfect focus. She turned the camera to face the operative directly. State your name and authority for the record. I am not required to. Because you have no legitimate authority, Sarah continued relentlessly. You operate outside congressional oversight, outside judicial review, outside any legal framework that could authorize what you've done. You are criminals hiding behind classification stamps. Marcus moved to flank the operative's position, not threateningly but strategically, forcing the government team to choose between maintaining weapons discipline and keeping their targets contained. His transformation had given him physical capabilities that clearly unsettled the tactical team. The facility is already destroyed, Elena announced, monitoring radio frequencies. Your people are eliminating evidence as we speak, which constitutes obstruction of justice and destruction of federal evidence. Every action you're taking adds years to your eventual sentences. The sound of approaching helicopters grew louder, but Sarah could see the operative making final calculations. He was running out of time to eliminate witnesses quietly, which meant he was approaching the moment when quiet elimination would become mass murder broadcast to the world. Last chance, Dr. Chen. The operative's voice carried deadly finality. Surrender your materials and submit to debriefing, or face immediate neutralization for terrorist activities. Sarah felt Marcus and Elena move closer, understanding that they had reached the moment when everything they discovered would be tested against everything the government was willing to do to protect its secrets. The weight of 12 years pressed against her chest, but it no longer felt like burden. It felt like momentum. She looked directly into the camera, speaking to every viewer who would see this footage in the days and years to come. This is the moment when ordinary citizens must choose between comfortable submission and dangerous truth. We choose truth. The operative raised his weapon, and Sarah realized that her transformation was complete. She was no longer afraid of dying, only of failing to ensure that their evidence survived. Everything Marcus had endured, everything they had discovered, Everything that mattered about justice and accountability balanced on the next few seconds. The ultimate test had arrived. The operative's finger moved toward the trigger, but the crack that split the air came not from his weapon, but from the sky above. A military helicopter, larger and bearing different markings than the Black Ops vehicles surrounding them, descended into the clearing with rotor wash that scattered tactical personnel and forced everyone to shield their faces. Sarah kept filming even as dust and debris whirled around them, understanding that this moment would either vindicate everything they'd suffered or become their final testimony. Through the chaos, she heard Marcus release a sound that was part growl, part recognition, a transformation that went beyond his physical appearance into something primal and protective. Federal marshals repelled from the descending aircraft, weapons drawn but targeting the anonymous operatives rather than Sarah's group. The lead marshal's voice boomed through a megaphone. By order of the Federal District Court, all personnel will stand down immediately. Dr. Chen and her associates are under federal protection pending congressional investigation. But the operative who had threatened them refused to lower his weapon. "This is a classified operation," he shouted over the helicopter noise. "You have no jurisdiction here." Sarah realized she was witnessing the moment when competing government authorities clashed openly, when the conspiracy that had operated in shadows for decades was forced to confront legitimate law enforcement in full public view. The camera captured everything as federal marshals surrounded the Black Ops team with professional efficiency. "Classification doesn't supersede constitutional law," the lead marshal declared. "Lower your weapons or be arrested for threatening federal witnesses." The standoff stretched for heartbeats that felt like hours. Sarah could see the operative calculating whether his superiors would support open conflict with federal marshals, whether the conspiracy reached high enough to protect him from legitimate prosecution. Marcus made the decision for everyone. He stepped directly into the line of fire between the operative and Sarah, his transformed form absorbing every camera angle, his presence undeniable proof of everything they'd alleged. "Shoot me," Marcus said, his voice carrying across the clearing with impossible calm. "On camera, in front of federal marshals, while the world watches. Show everyone exactly what you're willing to do to protect your secrets." The operative's weapon trembled, not with fear, but with the recognition that every choice led to exposure. Killing Marcus would prove their allegations. Surrendering would mean prosecution. Resisting federal marshals would trigger a firefight that would destroy any possibility of continued cover-up. Sarah felt the moment when 12 years of government control finally shattered. The operative slowly lowered his weapon, understanding that the conspiracy's power had always depended on operating in darkness. In full daylight, surrounded by legitimate law enforcement and broadcast to the world, they became what they had always been, criminals without legal protection. "Dr. Chen," the federal marshal approached with professional courtesy, "we have arrest warrants for 17 government officials based on your evidence submissions, but we need your testimony to ensure prosecutions succeed." Elena continued filming as handcuffs clicked onto the anonymous operatives, as their vehicles were secured as evidence, as the machinery of actual justice finally engaged with crimes that had been protected by classification for decades. But Sarah found herself looking at Marcus, understanding that his ordeal was far from over. The transformation he'd endured couldn't be reversed by arrests or prosecutions. He would spend the rest of his life bearing physical evidence of what the government had done to him. "The medical teams are standing by," she told him quietly, stepping close enough that the cameras couldn't capture her words. "We'll get you every treatment available, every therapy that might help." Marcus's transformed features arranged themselves into something that might have been a smile. "Help was finding you again. Everything else is aftermath." As they prepared to board the federal aircraft that would carry them to safety, Sarah realized that the confrontation was ending not with violence, but with something more powerful: absolute exposure. The government conspiracy that had operated through intimidation and murder was being dismantled by cameras and constitutional law. The operative who had threatened to kill them was loaded into a marshal's vehicle, his anonymity stripped away as Elena's camera captured his face for future identification. The weapons that had been trained on them were tagged as evidence of government misconduct. The clearing that had witnessed decades of cover-up became the site where truth finally prevailed. Dr. Walsh's helicopter descended to collect independent footage, while federal investigators secured the evidence that would fuel congressional hearings for months to come. Sarah watched it all with the exhausted satisfaction of someone who had carried an impossible burden for 12 years and finally found others strong enough to share the weight. As they lifted off from the Cherokee sacred ground, Sarah looked down at the place where everything had changed. The stones that had witnessed centuries of truth-telling had seen one more revelation, one more moment when courage confronted power and refused to yield. Marcus reached across the aircraft cabin with his transformed hand, and Sarah grasped it without hesitation. They had survived the confrontation that should have destroyed them, and in surviving, they had ensured that the truth would outlive every attempt to bury it. The real work of justice was just beginning, but the hardest part, choosing truth over survival, was finally complete. The federal aircraft's cabin hummed with the steady rhythm of rotor blades, but Sarah found no peace in their escape. She stared at Marcus across the narrow space, seeing not victory but the true cost of what they'd accomplished. His transformation was permanent. 12 years of genetic manipulation couldn't be undone by congressional hearings or criminal prosecutions. "The medical evaluations start tomorrow," she said, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "Dr. Walsh has connections at the CDC, specialists in genetic therapy, researchers who might—" Sarah Marcus's altered voice carried gentle finality. "We both know what the tests will show." She wanted to argue, to insist that science could reverse what science had created, but 12 years of research had taught her to recognize impossible odds. The creature the government had made from her research partner was stable, permanent, irreversible. Their victory had come at the cost of Marcus's humanity, and no amount of justice could restore what he'd lost. Elena continued filming from the front of the cabin, documenting their transport to federal protection. But Sarah could see the journalist's professional mask slipping. Even Elena, who had witnessed decades of government corruption, struggled with the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. The radio crackled with updates that should have felt like triumph: 17 federal arrests, congressional subpoenas issued, international human rights observers en route to investigate. The conspiracy that had operated in darkness for decades was being dragged into lethal sunlight. But Sarah felt only the weight of choices that couldn't be unmade. If she had stayed away from Mount Mitchell, if she had accepted Marcus's disappearance as final, if she had chosen comfortable ignorance over dangerous truth, he would still be trapped in that facility. But she wouldn't have to carry the knowledge of what he'd become. "How many others?" she asked the federal marshal who accompanied them. "How many people did they take?" "Preliminary estimates suggest 47 confirmed disappearances over 12 years, he replied with professional detachment. "Your partner was one of the earliest subjects. Most of the others—" He didn't finish the sentence. Most of the others were dead. Marcus had survived because his transformation was successful, because the government had kept him alive as proof that their experiments worked. His continued existence was evidence of their crimes, but it was also evidence of unspeakable suffering that would never end. The aircraft began its descent toward a federal facility where they would spend the next weeks providing testimony, reviewing evidence, ensuring that prosecutions succeeded. Sarah watched the landscape below, ordinary mountains hiding extraordinary horrors, peaceful forests that had witnessed systematic torture. "I need to ask something," Marcus said, leaning forward with effort. His transformed anatomy wasn't designed for aircraft seats. The footage Elena captured, the evidence we recovered, it has to be released publicly. Not just to congressional committees or federal prosecutors. Everyone needs to see what was done. Sarah understood what he was really asking. Marcus wanted his transformation documented completely, wanted the world to witness every detail of what government experimentation had cost. He was offering to sacrifice his privacy, his dignity, his chance for any normal existence, to ensure that similar facilities could never operate in secret again. "Marcus, you don't have to." "Yes, I do. His voice carried absolute certainty. 47 people died because this stayed secret. How many more will die if we protect classified operations with partial disclosure? Elena lowered her camera, understanding the weight of what Marcus proposed. Complete documentation would make him a symbol, a living reminder of government atrocity that would follow him forever. He would never have anonymity, never have peace, never have the possibility of disappearing into whatever life his transformation might allow. The medical evaluation will be public record, Sarah realized with growing horror. Every test, every examination, every attempt at treatment. They'll study you like a specimen. I've been a specimen for 12 years, Marcus replied. The only difference is choosing whether that serves their agenda or justice. The aircraft touched down with mechanical precision, but Sarah felt like she was crash-landing into a future she hadn't fully considered. They had won, the conspiracy was exposed, the criminals would face prosecution, the facility was destroyed. But victory demanded that Marcus spend the rest of his life proving their case, becoming a permanent exhibit in humanity's catalogue of institutional evil. As federal agents approached to escort them to debriefing, Sarah made her own choice about sacrifice. She would document every aspect of Marcus's condition, not for scientific curiosity but for historical record. She would ensure that his testimony reached every congressional hearing, every international tribunal, every forum where government officials claimed that classification served legitimate purposes. If Marcus was willing to sacrifice his humanity for truth, she could sacrifice her desire to protect him from further exploitation. The door opened, and camera flashes erupted from media personnel already gathered despite federal security. Marcus stepped into the light without hesitation, understanding that his transformation had become evidence that democracy required, horrifying, undeniable proof of power without accountability. The flashes were blinding, but Marcus never flinched. Sarah watched him stand perfectly still as photographers captured every angle of his transformation, their cameras clicking with mechanical hunger that reminded her of the monitoring equipment in the underground facility. The difference was that these images would serve truth rather than conceal it. Dr. Chen, reporters shouted questions over the federal marshal's attempts to maintain order. Can you confirm the genetic experimentation allegations? Is this your missing research partner? How long has the government been conducting these operations? Sarah stepped beside Marcus, understanding that this moment would define how the world understood everything they'd endured. Her scientific training demanded precision, but her exhaustion made every word feel impossibly heavy. 12 years ago, Dr. Marcus Webb disappeared while conducting legitimate cryptid research on Mount Mitchell, she announced, her voice carrying across the chaotic scene. What you see before you is the result of systematic government experimentation conducted without consent, without oversight, and without regard for human dignity. A young reporter pushed closer, his camera focused on Marcus's altered features. Sir, can you tell us what they did to you? Marcus's response sent a chill through the crowd. They didn't just experiment on my body. They tried to erase my mind, my memory, my connection to everything that made me human. For 12 years I existed as Subject 47 in a facility that officially didn't exist. Sarah felt the weight of 46 other subjects who couldn't stand in this spotlight, who couldn't tell their stories, whose transformations had ended in death rather than survival. The crowd's silence stretched as the magnitude of the allegations settled into public consciousness. Elena emerged from the aircraft carrying additional equipment, her journalist instincts already focused on preserving this moment for history. But Sarah noticed something unexpected in her expression, not just professional satisfaction at exposing corruption, but genuine grief for what Marcus had become. The evidence we've gathered includes facility records, video documentation, genetic analysis, and testimony from surviving personnel, Elena announced to the media crowd. This isn't conspiracy theory or speculation. This is documented proof of crimes against humanity conducted by American government agencies. Federal marshals began escorting them toward the facility, but Sarah realized that Marcus was struggling with more than the physical demands of walking. Every step carried him further from any possibility of normal existence and deeper into a future where his transformation would be examined, analyzed, and debated by strangers forever. "How does it feel to be free?" another reporter called out. Marcus stopped walking entirely. For a moment, Sarah thought he might collapse under the weight of a question that revealed how little anyone understood about their situation. Freedom implied choice, but Marcus's options had been eliminated by 12 years of irreversible manipulation. "Freedom," he said finally, "means choosing how your suffering serves the world. I can hide what they did to me, or I can ensure that everyone understands the cost of allowing government operations to exist without accountability." Inside the federal facility, the chaos of media attention gave way to clinical efficiency that felt uncomfortably familiar. Medical personnel waited to begin comprehensive examinations, legal teams prepared to document every aspect of Marcus's testimony. Congressional liaisons scheduled hearings that would stretch for months. Sarah found herself in a sterile conference room, facing federal prosecutors who needed her to transform 12 years of pain into legally admissible evidence. The irony wasn't lost on her. After fighting government exploitation, she was now cooperating with government officials who promised justice, but still viewed Marcus primarily as evidence rather than victim. Dr. Chen, the lead prosecutor, began. "We need you to understand that this case will reshape how Congress oversees classified research. Your partner's condition provides unprecedented documentation of constitutional violations, but the legal process will require extensive medical evaluation." Sarah looked through the conference room window at Marcus submitting to preliminary health screenings, understanding that he was already disappearing into the machinery of justice just as completely as he had vanished into the machinery of experimentation. The only difference was that this exploitation served transparency rather than secrecy. "He's not evidence," she said quietly. "He's a person who survived something that should never have happened." "We understand that, Dr. Chen. But his testimony could prevent similar facilities from operating. His condition could force Congress to implement oversight that saves lives. The greater good," Sarah interrupted, "was 12 years ago when we were conducting legitimate research that might have helped people. Everything since then has been about justifying the choices other people made about his life." Through the window, she watched Marcus answer medical questions with patient cooperation, understanding that his transformation had made him a symbol more than a man. He would spend whatever remained of his existence proving what government power could do to individuals who couldn't defend themselves. The resolution they'd achieved wasn't victory, it was the best possible outcome for an impossible situation. Justice would be served, but at the cost of Marcus's permanent sacrifice to historical record. Sarah signed the first document in what would become thousands of pages of testimony, understanding that some victories were indistinguishable from loss. 6 months after the hearings concluded, Sarah stood in the doorway of her new laboratory at the University of North Carolina, watching her graduate students process tissue samples with the same methodical precision she'd once brought to cryptid research. But everything was different now. Where she'd once sought creatures that might not exist, she now studied genetic sequences that documented humanity's capacity for systematic cruelty. The congressional testimony had ended with unprecedented legislation, the Marcus Webb Oversight Act, requiring independent monitoring of all classified biological research. 17 federal officials faced prison sentences. The facility beneath Mount Mitchell had been sealed permanently, its existence officially acknowledged after decades of denial. But Sarah's victory felt hollow as she reviewed the morning's correspondence. 3 letters from families whose relatives had disappeared near government installations. 2 requests for genetic analysis that might connect missing persons to classified experiments. A phone call from a journalist in Colorado who'd found similar patterns near military bases. The work never ended because the crimes hadn't been isolated to a single facility or a single decade. Her testimony had revealed one operation among dozens, one victim among hundreds, one success story amid countless failures. "Dr. Chen?" Her research assistant appeared in the doorway, holding a tablet displaying news footage. "They're running the anniversary special on Channel 7. Sarah accepted the tablet reluctantly, recognizing the familiar images of Marcus standing before congressional microphones, his transformed features illuminated by harsh federal lighting as he detailed 12 years of experimentation. The footage had become iconic, a living reminder that democracy's greatest threats came from within its own institutions. She changed the channel, unwilling to witness Marcus's continued exploitation by media outlets that reduced his suffering to entertainment. Even sympathetic coverage made him a symbol rather than acknowledging his humanity, and Sarah had grown protective of his dignity in ways that sometimes surprised her. Her phone rang with Marcus's number, their daily check-in that had become routine since he'd chosen to live in a remote cabin near Asheville rather than submit to ongoing federal monitoring. The government had wanted to house him permanently, to continue studying his condition under the guise of providing medical care, but Sarah had threatened to withdraw her cooperation if they didn't respect his autonomy. "The anniversary coverage is everywhere," Marcus said without preamble, his altered voice carrying weary amusement. "CNN wants another interview. 60 Minutes is offering documentary participation. The History Channel wants to dramatize our story with professional actors." "You don't have to do any of it," Sarah reminded him, the same conversation they'd had dozens of times over the past months. "You've given enough testimony to last 3 lifetimes. But stopping means letting them control the narrative again. Every interview I decline, every documentary I refuse, creates space for government officials to minimize what happened or suggest that classified research serves necessary purposes." Sarah understood his logic, but hated its implications. Marcus remained trapped by his transformation, not just physically but socially and politically. His continued existence as evidence meant he could never simply be Marcus Webb, survivor and friend. He was permanently Marcus Webb, living proof of institutional evil, condemned to repeat his trauma whenever democracy required reminding of its vulnerabilities. "I have something different to discuss today," Marcus continued. "Dr. Walsh contacted me about establishing a research foundation, privately funded, completely transparent, focused on helping people who've been harmed by classified medical experiments. She thinks we could create something positive from what we've been through." Sarah felt her first genuine spark of hope in months. A foundation would give you control over how your story gets used. You could help other survivors without becoming a permanent exhibition. "That's what I thought. But I need a scientific director who understands both the research implications and the political dimensions. Someone who's seen what happens when good intentions get corrupted by government secrecy." The offer hung between them, a chance to transform their ordeal into systematic assistance for other victims, to build something constructive from the wreckage of Marcus's life and her career. But it would also mean permanently dedicating herself to investigating government crimes rather than returning to the pure research that had originally drawn her to biology. "When do we start?" she asked, understanding that her answer had been inevitable from the moment she'd chosen to return to Mount Mitchell 6 months ago. "Tomorrow, if you're ready." Walsh already has files on 43 potential cases, families who've been waiting years for someone to take their claims seriously. After ending the call, Sarah looked around her university laboratory one final time. She'd built a secure, respectable career here, far from the dangers that had consumed the past year, but respectability felt like cowardice when she knew how many people remained trapped in situations similar to what Marcus had endured. She began packing her research materials, understanding that some transformations were irreversible for survivors and rescuers alike. The woman who'd climbed Mount Mitchell seeking closure no longer existed. In her place stood someone who'd learned that justice demanded constant vigilance, that freedom required defending people who couldn't defend themselves, and that some victories could only be measured by preventing future atrocities rather than undoing past ones. Tomorrow, she would begin the work that Marcus's sacrifice had made possible. Today, she mourned the simpler world they'd both lost forever, the new beginning. 2 years later, Sarah stood before the weathered bronze plaque mounted outside the Marcus Webb Research Foundation, watching morning sunlight illuminate the dedication for those whose voices were silenced and those who refused to let them be forgotten. the modest building in downtown Asheville bore no resemblance to the sterile government facilities that had consumed so much of their lives, its warm brick facade and large windows designed to welcome rather than intimidate. Inside, her team of 12 researchers worked quietly at stations equipped with state-of-the-art genetic analysis equipment, their focus split between current cases and the growing database of families seeking answers about disappeared relatives. The Foundation had processed over 300 inquiries in its first year, providing closure for 67 families and compelling federal investigations into 4 additional facilities. Dr. Chen? Elena Martinez looked up from her computer terminal, where she'd been reviewing security footage from a family's home near Fort Bragg. The Hendersons are here for their consultation. Sarah nodded, reviewing the case file as she walked toward the conference room. Military contractor disappeared during classified assignment. Family told he died in a training accident, but genetic evidence suggested ongoing experimentation similar to what Marcus had endured. The pattern had become depressingly familiar. Bureaucratic lies masking systematic exploitation, families gasping for truth in the silence of official denial. The Hendersons sat close together at the conference table, holding hands with the desperate intensity of people who'd learned not to trust institutional promises. Mrs. Henderson clutched a folder of photographs showing her husband before his assignment, every image a reminder of the man who'd been taken from their children. "We've completed preliminary analysis of the tissue sample you provided," Sarah began gently. "I'm afraid our findings confirm your suspicions. The genetic markers match patterns we've documented in other cases of involuntary experimentation." Mr. Henderson's father closed his eyes, vindication and devastation warring across his weathered features. 23 years we've been fighting for answers. 23 years of being told we were conspiracy theorists, that David died serving his country. "Your son did serve his country," Sarah said firmly. "But his country failed to protect him from people who viewed soldiers as disposable test subjects. That failure doesn't diminish his sacrifice. It makes his loss a call for accountability." Through the conference room windows, she could see Marcus working in the Foundation's garden, his transformed hands surprisingly gentle as he tended vegetables that would supply the local food bank. Physical labor had become his meditation, a way of creating something life-giving after years of being subjected to procedures designed to strip away his humanity. The Hendersons left with promises of continued investigation and connections to legal resources, but Sarah knew their real healing would come from time and community rather than courtroom victories. Justice mattered, but it couldn't restore what had been stolen. It could only prevent future thefts. Elena appeared in the doorway as Sarah finished updating the case file. "Channel 12 wants a statement about the Anderson conviction. 3 years in federal prison for his role in the Mount Mitchell facility." Sarah shook her head. "We've said everything necessary about Anderson. Let the conviction speak for itself." She'd grown protective of the Foundation's mission, refusing to let their work become entertainment for news outlets that sensationalized trauma. The families they served deserved dignity, not spectacle. And Sarah had learned to guard their stories carefully. At the end of the workday, she found Marcus sitting on the building's back porch, watching shadows lengthen across the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance. His transformation remained obvious: the elongated limbs, the altered facial structure, the predatory grace that marked him as something no longer entirely human. But 2 years of freedom had restored something indefinable to his presence, a peace that government captivity had tried to extinguish. "Good day?" she asked, settling into the chair beside him. Morrison family called. The genetic analysis we provided helped them file a successful wrongful death lawsuit. Government settled out of court, but more importantly, they got acknowledgement that their daughter didn't simply disappear. She was taken. Sarah felt the familiar satisfaction that had become her new measure of success. Not the clean victories of academic research, not the publication credits and conference presentations that had once defined her career, but the quiet triumphs of families finding truth after years of institutional gaslighting. "Any regrets?" she asked, a question that had become their evening ritual. Marcus considered the mountains that had once hidden his prison, his expression peaceful in the fading light. I regret what was done to me. I regret the other subjects who didn't survive. I regret that we can't save people who died before we understood what was happening. He paused, watching a hawk circle above the valley floor. But I don't regret becoming someone who can prevent it from happening again. My transformation destroyed the man I was, but it created the person these families need. Sarah reached over and took his altered hand in hers, understanding finally that some endings were actually beginnings, painful births of purposes they'd never imagined. The work would continue because the need would continue, but they faced it now with clear eyes and willing hearts. Tomorrow would bring new cases, new families seeking answers, new evidence of humanity's capacity for both cruelty and courage. Tonight, they rested in the knowledge that their sacrifice had meaning beyond their own suffering. The mountains watched over them both, keeping their ancient secrets while witnessing this small victory of hope over despair.